Recording. Go for it. So one first thing, there were these handouts here, and actually it looks like some of one got put on top of the other. So they're usually different colors. You can see them. You might be looking at the same thing twice. So there's actually two, but it taught me a lesson that we should probably mark these better for when they're printed in black and white. Thanks for having me here today and for being here. I'm a part of the community that does this work, and so it's been really fun to be on a cross kind of campus and actually institutional committee with folks who are really interested in qualitative methods, what qualitative methods can do, and how they're kind of different across different sectors and ways of thinking. And so I'm going to try to bring a little bit of more of the qualitative thinking around this than just the findings from the project, but I'm going to do both because it's pretty interesting. So let me give you a little bit of background on this project. There we go. Okay, let me start with, those were a lot of titles really for all the different committees and things that I have to do. So I just added to my signature to make it look really important. But what I spend most of my time doing, I am an associate professor and I do teach in our nonprofit program for the Master's of Public Administration. And I teach qualitative methods and research methods to folks who don't really know what to do, like why they're taking those methods. So I got trained a long time ago in trying to help people think about how methods and numbers could help translate into practice. And so that's what I try to do with our students. But at the center, we do trainings for folks who are working in cross-sector collaboration. So today we call it the network way of working. Almost everyone's required to work in some kind of cross-sector partnership, no matter what field you're in, what sector you're in now. And we recognize that people don't really have skills for how to do that work. They're running programs, right? And they've gone to school for other things, or they're community members or funders, or whoever they are that haven't really had a background in building networks. So we offer trainings in that area. We actually call it network leadership. Next week is our 3-day training academy where people come from all over the country to do this, from the Navy, to school districts, these kinds of things. But we also do evaluation on systems, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. A lot of people ask us to either help build their capacity to do that work in their community, or they hire us to do that for them when they are fortunate enough to have the resources to do that. And finally, we build tools. So we have created 2 software tools. The first one is called Partner, and folks can use it to collect network data on their communities. It was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for 7 years. It's been used in 2,000 communities, translated into 5 languages, and we built it to build capacity for people to do that work, so they don't have to hire us. So we built it in a way that made it easy for them to do kind of network analysis. So that's really where I spend most of my time. But I'll show you how what I'm going to talk about today is a little different. And then we have a new tool called the Person-Centered Network App, which uses a network methodology to assess a person's personal support network, find where they have gaps in the things they need, and then link them to resources in the community. So in that context, we were contacted by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Amy Casey Foundation, about 2.5 years ago now. And they said, we have this group of a network in Baltimore called the Baltimore Integration Partnership. And that's called the BIP. The BIP had been around for a couple of years. They were funded by the Annie Casey Foundation as well as a group called Living Cities to do to create an anchor initiative in the city. So anchor initiatives, well, at the time, I didn't know what anchors were, to be honest. So they called because they said, we want you to study this network, this system of anchors that are working together. And that's what we do, so it's all right. But it did take me a little while to get up to speed on this. And I'm always even surprised when I'm talking about anchor institutions because it was nothing. I was studying public health and, areas like that. But so I thought I would share with you my learning around that. So anchor institutions are considered organizations that are usually large institutions that have opportunity to hire people, to purchase locally, maybe even to educate or provide some kind of care for people. So hospitals and universities are good candidates for being anchor institutions. They are thought to be kind of anchored in that community, so maybe they should have motivations for thinking about how the people in their communities are living. The anchor is kind of a philosophy as much as it is a place. It's a way of thinking about how the way that you run your business, whether you are a hospital, university, a nonprofit, or private sector, the way you run your business is thoughtful of the way that you could bring wealth building into the communities around you. So in what ways can we hire people from our local communities? How do we purchase from them? How do we extend contracts to them? In Baltimore, this is an effort they refer to actually as economic inclusion. So those policies, how does Johns Hopkins, Loyola, MICA, University of Baltimore, Coppin State, Bon Secours, so a range of anchor institutions in Baltimore, do more work around hiring the people in their communities and purchasing locally, purchasing from minority and women-owned businesses, and helping think about how do we extend contracts to those folks. So, I mean, a lot of the anchor work will sound familiar to those who've been thinking about community engagement for a long time, and that is kind of like an entry into anchor work. How do we engage communities and work with communities? For universities, that's often talked about, like how do we bring service learning, which is a community connection in. Anchor work takes that like one step further. Anchor work is actually an economic solution to building communities up. So it's really the question of how do we change our practices, or how do we extend that community engagement to bring up the capacity of the community around us. And since we do have purchasing power or hiring power, how do we do that in that framework? So the anchor framework is a little unique. It's a little different than saying we're a community engaged organization. So in Baltimore, they had brought together around a table like this 9 anchor institutions. At the time, it's now 14. And what I'm going to talk about today is our role as the evaluators of that work. So Annie Casey Foundation said to us, they like our partner tool, the network stuff, and they said, can you come evaluate this board that we have, how they built a network amongst themselves, and do it at time 1 and 2. And I was like, sure, it's odd that you're bringing me in from Colorado to think about how local institutions hire locally, but I will do that if you think we're the right partner. And we went there, and well, the first thing that happened was we started learning, like I learned what an anchor was. And then we started learning about it, and what made more sense to me than that they wanted me to do a network survey was that they wanted me to look at a complex system. That's what I really love, and that's what I was really excited to kind of learn more about. The anchor work is not just about anchors. It's about the communities that are involved. It's about what's happening at the anchors, and it's also about this network that they have formed. So we went back to Annie Casey after they'd given us the contract and we had the scope of work done, and we said, can we just change this? Can we actually take a qualitative approach to this? Because from what we're seeing as outsiders, is that there's a huge system here that nobody's really taken a look at, and nobody's really understanding who's doing what and whose perspective on what is coming, to bear here. So we said, instead of time 1 and 2 with this network survey, could we instead do interviews with people at anchor institutions to ask them, what are you doing at your anchor institution? What does economic inclusion look like? Who's doing it? Questions like that. Then can we, phase 2, go to the community and ask the community, how do you view the anchors as an opportunity or not? And what's your interaction with anchors? What do anchors need to know about you in order to interact with them around a really good policy change inside their institution? And then at phase 3, we'll do the survey you hired us to do. And they said yes, they actually liked this approach. And I think they were kind of, they didn't really believe us that we could really pull it off, I think. In fact, a lot of folks said to us, people probably won't talk to you. You probably won't get a lot of response, but go ahead. So this is actually the goals, and I talked about this. Economic inclusion for them, they have 3 areas that they focus on. So the first is procurement. How do we purchase locally. This is a really difficult thing for an anchor institution to do. It's not so easy to say, let's find local vendors and buy from them. One reason is a lot of institutions have contracts with big organizations like Staples, our university does. And what I learned from this work is companies like that, at the end of a purchasing year, I don't know what that is, they will give institutions big refunds back if they spend a certain amount of money. So there's tons of incentives to purchase from them. And there's also, and I'll go through this a little bit, we know that local vendors may not have the capacity to meet the needs that big institutions have. So I'll go through these in a minute here. Capital community development is really about the kind of work that anchor institutions do, like building new buildings, replacing windows, repainting the building. So things like that, like how can we hire people from minority or women-owned businesses, or can they be part of the subcontracts that go out to big contractors? Because we know that, like especially in Baltimore, the same companies kind of get those contracts all the time. And then workforce development is really around hiring. In Baltimore, the biggest issue they're trying to face is hiring returning citizens. So people who have, especially African-American males, have been convicted and spent time in prison, trying to re-enter the workforce. That's the biggest population in Baltimore that's trying to re-enter the workforce. And so anchor institutions are most challenged by figuring out ways to overcome issues of having criminal backgrounds and being able to work in their anchor institutions. You might have heard of ban the box legislation. It's legislation that they did pass in Maryland, and other states are doing the same, which says that you cannot have a box on the application that says, have you ever been convicted, so that people can get to the second interview. Nothing at the second interview prevents them from asking, so it only gets you to the second interview, but for some folks that would be an open door. It's like a Band-Aid to make some folks feel better in a way, but this is a big challenge for anchors as well, because they're thinking about safety, they're thinking about the skills and backgrounds that people have, and so it's again, none of these are easy. And to move organizations, in any way is like moving a mountain, so we'll talk about that a little bit here. This is what I just talked about. When we went in, this is what they wanted us to study and do network surveys on, that group right there. And so what we proposed was, can we add all of this to it? But this might scare a lot of people, but like, this is what I like to think about, is complex systems and how systems work together. And what we did is, we kind of got our questions to help guide us. The most obvious one was we said, how is economic inclusion implemented within the anchors? We needed to know that. But this next part, we just applied to all three phases. So what parts of the system are strong and what parts are weak? And we just let that question really guide us. So in every conversation we had, that is a tone that we took. We wanted to know what are the best parts about this piece that you play in the system, and what are the most difficult, challenging parts. And what our job was to put it all together in the end for them, and to be able to highlight, because there's so much good work. We didn't want to come back with all the weaknesses, right? To highlight kind of that piece of it. So we also, of course, needed to look at how the system is interconnected and what parts of the system are impacted by others. So that's what we do on all of our projects. That feels okay, but it's a big question. What's most important to us is that we end with, how are we coming out with knowledge that's actionable for our anchors? And because some things are not actually actionable, they're like big ideas or big problems. So we also wanted to make sure that we just ask the question, what can the anchors just learn? And then how can they use that learning to think forward? All right, so I mentioned that we kind of did this to gain the three perspectives. So we always take a community-based participatory approach, the CVPR approach. I guess I should say research in there. So our approach is always to go, when we work with the community, is we immediately go to the community, wherever they are at, and we let them know we're about to do this work and what can they tell us. Like before we even say how we're going to do this work, we ask them to teach us about their community, to talk about it. We'll usually get some kind of key informants, is what we will call them, to just help us learn the language, help us understand the tensions that were going on. So we did a lot of that work. It's almost getting to know you kind of work. At the foundation, we did that with them. We did it with the city, with the BIP. The BIP, our first meeting, they were like, we didn't want this evaluation. good to know that before we take one more step. So, so we did that. But then we also, you know, when we create like our interview guide, we give it to all those people. Are we asking the right questions? They tell us. We get the data in, we'll summarize it, we do that work, and then we give it to them, what do you think about this? And then they tell us, and they'll say, you know, different perspectives interpret the data differently. So we try to incorporate that into the way we present it back. So first we ended up working with the anchors, and our goal was to talk to people at all 9 anchor institutions in the areas of procurement, workforce development, and capital development. And I'm going to show you how we did that. That was the hardest thing, is like, how do you go through an anchor institution and find out who to talk to? Like, who are the managers at each of these levels? That was a huge question. And again, everyone said to us, I don't think anyone will talk to you. But our perspective is, and what you'll know from doing interviews, right, is that when you ask people about themselves, they want to talk, right? So we just ask people to tell us about themselves and their lives and the challenges that they were facing and what was working really well. And the only people who said no were literally people we just kind of couldn't schedule, and they were only in the anchor institution. Community people, like, we couldn't make enough time, you know, for the people who wanted to talk. So communities, we ended up talking for the community perspective to 61 people. Our definition of community for the study was workforce development agencies, small business agencies, neighborhood associations, minority and women-owned vendors, and residents seeking employment. So we have a kind of a split, like 20 or so are like, it's really like the nonprofit sector that plays a role in this. Some of it's public agencies, government, most of it's workforce development, but the people who are trying to help people get jobs at anchor institutions. The vendors we talked to, this was a first for the BIP. Like, no one had actually even thought to ask the vendors to come and present. They're kind of a mystery to folks, but we were under bridges and highways, you know, inside of people's, you know, storefronts. It was just eating at restaurants with them, just a lot of different folks. And then the residents, the workforce development agencies helped us access that. So that group of people were people who, the first person we talked to had been in prison for 26 years, now for 6 months, and he was the best person we could talk to because we needed him to figure out how to talk to the other 20 people. And we talked to people who had jobs at anchors, who had tried to get jobs at anchors and were done, never going to try again, and folks who they just were trying to get jobs anywhere they could. And just to put some context on that, for these folks, like getting a job at the anchor institution, you know, doing landscaping or cleaning out in the operating rooms or whatever they're doing are really good jobs for them. And they would talk about them getting paid $10 to $12 an hour, maybe getting benefits. And I mean, and these people were like thanking us for asking questions that they thought maybe they could help. Some people, I think, interviewed, we gave them incentives, the residents. We gave them gift cards to the grocery store. And they, though, I think some of them thought we might be hiring like on behalf of the anchors. So there was just, but they all spoke with us. So, and we ended up doing a network analysis. I'm not going to really show much about that here, but with the BIP, and we actually ended up with, I think, about 58 organizations that participated in the network analysis, and super interesting stuff. That stuff is a little bit more internal, so they're thinking of how they're managing that network. Some of it's a little hard for them to digest because it showed who was present and who's not. It showed a real lack of maybe matching with their mission. It's probably the most I could say. And so they're trying to, we're working with them to help them think about how to use that information to kind of build a stronger network of anchors. Okay, so here, I'm just going to show you this one slide of like how we found people, right? I mean, you all are familiar with snowball sampling and asking someone who I should talk to, right? This was different. We're like anchor institutions, and the BIP was like, here's one contact at all 9 anchors, and that's the person who's on the board. So we talked to that person, and we told them, what we did is, in that conversation, we asked them to help us do these workforce pathways for those 3 areas. So we would start like with procurement. Let's say someone in one of your departments wants to buy something. What do? And they would tell us, well, first they have to do this, then they have to get their key card, and then they have to go there, and then they'll get that approval. And we asked them for a bunch of scenarios. And then we said, tell us about how hiring happens. And they would say, say, we give them an example, let's say you need to hire a housekeeper. They would tell us, this is Micah, is at the Maryland Institute in College for Arts. And they would tell us what all the process was to hire a person in Micah. So we did this in all 3 categories across all 9 anchor institutions. And after we mapped them, finished that, we sent the map to the person and we said, now tell us who does that. And then tell us who does that, and who does that, and who does that. And that's our sample for each anchor institution. So it was a lot of work. And when they were like, no one will talk to you, I think part of the problem is they don't know who those people are. So we have these really great lists of the anchor institutions of who does what. So we ended up doing interviews with those people at the different anchor institutions. And one last thing I want to show you about our method is how we do interviews. So I always say I'm not a purist of qualitative methods because I'm too structured. So I love rows and columns, and I like data really well organized, and that doesn't fit into the profile of like a typical kind of qualitative researcher. So, but I love qualitative research, and I love what we get from it. So what you see here is we have this form that we start with on every project, and this is like an interview guide for us. And what you're not seeing here is those little gray boxes. When you click on one and click on it, and you start typing, and the text turns blue. So what we do is we use this to organize things. So sometimes in our work, we need to kind of figure out what our questions are. So we do more unstructured interviews, figure it out, but we always try to get to a place where we have filling this out. I teach qualitative methods, so I use this. And so that's why it says you can list questions like this. Some questions might have a predetermined response. These are instructions that people use. I work with a lot of nonprofit agencies too, and I try to help them think about how they might collect data, qualitative data, because it's overwhelming for them. So we use this kind of as a how-to guide. So we did about half of our interviews over the phone and half in person. In person, we record them and transcribe them later. Over the phone, our team's kind of trained to type while people talk. I personally have probably done, 500 phone interviews. I can type as fast as people talk, even as fast as I talk. I don't even record my interviews because I trust myself. So I fill this out and I tab through it as people talk, and it's like a live, what is the word, like a free stream? I can't think of a term. I'm not trying to organize it while I'm talking. Just typing it out. But the benefit of doing it this way is that I already have one level of organization happening. So for me, that works really well, my style of qualitative research, and luckily my team. I don't know if that's their choice, but we do a lot of this. And so what our goal is in qualitative research is to figure out how we're going to make sense of a lot of data without being overwhelmed. Every step we do is we consider data reduction step. So we're never using our data to create more data. That's just a practice we do not do because we'll never get through this work, right? So this is our first attempt at data reduction while collecting data. So that's why I'm not a purist. I'm sure the qualitative researchers in the room are like, what is she doing? That's how we do it. And that leads us to organizing the data. So this is really hard to see, but this accompanies the template that we have. And in fact, in this project, we did an experiment where we did some analysis in vivo and some using our Excel sheet to see what the benefits were of using each method. Because this is what we usually use, and we were like, are we really missing something? So our team split that way. We had 4 of us. So this is how we organize in Excel. I'll just go through it really quick. Each name here is a respondent. We did need to know their organization. And again, this is a template people use. So what we do in our data reduction work is we read through our interviews, and you'll see each here this is one of each question. So in my table, this is like one of those boxes. Read through it, and right here, we write a summary. So we're immediately going from a long answer to a summary. Sometimes the summary is long, sometimes it's short. And then we write any notable quotes here. And then this right here is where we work. And so we do all of this first, and then we spend iterations of time as a team going through this. The first thing we do is just create as many buckets of themes and information as possible in these columns. And then we start to work on reducing those into, more, not as many buckets. So the fewest number of things we can come to without feeling like we've missed stuff. And then we do, like the cardinal sin of qualitative research, we quantify it. We put counts in there. Sometimes that's a valence, like it's a lot or a little of what that is. But what we try to do is we actually do try to get counts. And then right here, so this can have like 10 different, say that versions 1 through or 20, depending on how many times our teams go through this work. It's a lot of work. We're not doing all that hard work. And then here, once that's all clean, we have split up, or someone does all of them right at the summary here of that data point. We've literally written papers where we just come back and we just copy these and just put it in the paper. Like here's finding 1, and we just copy this and put it in. See, I'm like so organized. You can imagine that like poor kid has to go through my daily basis. But like this makes sense to me in a way to handle a lot of big data. So I wanted to share that because of the context of this talk is a little bit beyond just the findings. So we did this for the BIP. So we took all of our interviewees, and we have one for the anchor work. We have a whole different set of data for the community work, and split them up into all kinds of different categories. It's a pretty huge data set that we have. But one reason I like this too is that if you said to me, how did you come up with that conclusion? I can show you. This is what I would call our archival or audit trail of the work. And when my students do qualitative projects, they have to show me their audit trails. When we get a capstone and they say, I did 10 interviews and here's what I found. And I'm like, how did you figure that out? I want to know how your thinking went from reading a lot of people or listening to a lot of people to real findings that affect communities, right? So I'm probably like one of the hardest qualitative methods teachers they'll have. Any questions about that? All right. I go fast. All right, so now let me show you how we use that method and all of that background. This is what we learned when we did that work in Baltimore with this group. I know I just kind of flip-flopped there. So what I'm going to do, and I mean, really, I only have like a few more slides, I guess, but I guess half. But we worked really hard to bring this down into a little bit of information to share a presentation. So you can imagine there's a ton here. I mean, the final report, it has all 3 sections in it. We have one report that's just community interviews, like just phase 2. What you're seeing over there, what you have, maybe 2 copies of, is we do research briefs. So each phase of our project has a different brief. The people we're working with need the brief, right? They can't even, I mean, we do presentations for the board, but the briefs are super important to help people understand, especially these complex things. So that's how we kind of put it together. So this work I'll show you first is the findings from the anchor institutions. So, and there's just a couple. One of the things we learned, we asked people, like, how do you define economic inclusion? Like, what is economic inclusion to you? So what we learned is, across these 9 anchor institutions, people talk about it really differently. And there's this kind of continuum, right? So there's some folks that talk kind of about meeting requirements. And so what they would say are things like, well, we're trying to make sure that all of our contracts require 10% subcontract to minority and women vendors. So they like list the requirements for meeting economic inclusion. And that's kind of their process. That's the way they're thinking about it. Those people refer to the zip code a lot, hiring in the zip code. Like they're just really trying to say, what do I have to do? How do we change that policy? And where is it? Then you have this whole group of people that say, well, we're doing this work because it's positive outcomes for people. They kind of extend it out of their own policies and they start thinking about how the people in the community are affected by it. And then on the very last end, you hear people who are like, there's just no choice because economic inclusion is just the way of life. And if we don't do it, our whole community is failing. So it was really different and we wanted to acknowledge that. When we report to the BIP, we actually kind of show where the anchor institutions fall on this. And it's not surprising that the historically Black universities fall to that end over there. I mean, they're like, I don't need this anchor initiative. They're like, we just hire. And they literally will say, we open our doors and people walk in and we try to hire them. You know, and it's really different in places like Loyola where this is a really new shift for them. So we did kind of break it up this way a little bit. So 2 of the anchors that we talked to, this is like really new thinking for them. And There were 3 that's historically part of their culture, and 4 where they're kind of just somewhere in between. And there's just little quotes there to kind of show how people talked about and how we kind of bucketed them. But here's the greatest achievement that we heard from about the BIP and their role in all of this, is that across the 9 anchor institutions, there has been an organizational culture shift. I mean, all 9 of them are talking about anchor institutions, and their leadership is talking about it. And we felt like, as evaluators, this is an enormous accomplishment. So we wanted to really highlight this because moving an organizational culture into any new space is very hard. Not surprisingly, what we learned as we did interviews from like hiring managers, we really talked to people who were supposed to be implementing this. It kind of, leadership was all over it, and then it just started to fall off, this organizational culture shift. To the point where some people were like, I don't know, no one's ever talked to me about this. To other people saying, I just follow policy. So if leadership tells me I need to hire 10%, I'm gonna hire 10%. And so, and that ranged as well too. We spoke to a woman who didn't know that term. No one had talked to her about this. She said, I saw this on the news. She told me, I saw that folks were doing this on the news. And she said, she said, I hire contractors, and what I thought about was if I have a demo project, and if I bid it out, the way I always do, then the smaller businesses won't have capacity to do it. But if I break it up into 2 demo projects, it can give more people opportunities, and she did. And she said, I know it's more for me to manage. I have to manage 2 contracts, I have to manage 2 crews, but she was able to attract more minority and women-owned vendors or contractors when the project was smaller. So she was just creatively thinking about that on her own. So those kinds of practices are not quite adopted across, but still, we put this as the greatest achievement because it's just amazing, really, when you get leadership to all start, even talking about something in the same way. We also looked at this as a great achievement. So this is from our qualitative data. We just kind of qualitatively mapped out how people talk to each other, and this is actually not the most accurate version of this. We kind of enhanced it to make it look easier. This is where we started, and this is where the BIP was kind of at this point. Here's the BIP, the actual organization convening everyone, like the backbone. These are the universities, and they did have some city people in there. But what we have over here is like the community voice part. And the anchors agreed that everyone we talked to, that the community voice was just really not present in the work. And a lot of them were like, of course not, it's too hard. Of course this is not part of it. And some folks, lamented that was like not as good. And then they did talk about their own individual relationships. But the BIP doesn't itself have, we just heard today about the work going on here in Anschutz, and the representation from residents and community is hugely, amazingly great here on this campus. It's not so in Baltimore. I mean, that's history in Baltimore, tensions around and distrust between the anchors and the people in Baltimore. But we saw it there, so we kind of wanted to show that. And then people talk about these barriers at the anchor institution for doing economic inclusion work. So this is where we said where it's strong and where is it kind of weak, right? So these are consistent themes across the anchors. We heard a lot of other things, but everyone talked about identifying vendors was difficult. There is no such thing as just like the list of minority and women-owned vendors. And that is for several reasons. This came up later in the community interviews, but vendors can apply for certification as a minority or women-owned business. In Baltimore and Maryland, there's a city certification and a state certification. It's very difficult to navigate that process, and a lot of the vendors don't feel like it's worth it. Some vendors actually told us they felt like it was a bad idea to get that designation if people wouldn't hire them. And so it's really complicated. What it leaves the anchors with is just confusion about who they can hire. Ourselves at the downtown campus are putting on an event next week, and we committed to having all of our catering done, 3-day event, by minority and women-owned vendors. And it was, I'm like, I'm smart about this now, right? And it's very difficult to find folks that have the capacity to do it, can deliver, you know, and just in terms of us saying who we talk to, you know, there's a lot of capacity building opportunities in the community. That's a vendor capacity piece, is that a guy at Johns Hopkins who is in charge of actually HR, said that he just on his own was trying to identify a vendor in the community that he could kind of help build capacity with to provide a service to all the anchors. He had identified can liners, even trash can liners, as something that everyone needed. And he said stadiums need it, our anchors need it. This guy he found and his son made those. And so he helped the guy figure out how to purchase the warehouse, even purchase the truck, start getting orders from these. And it was actually, by the time I spoke to him, it actually hadn't worked. The capacity for that family to run that business wasn't there. And so he said, I'm going to try a different business now. But really vendor capacity is a huge issue. You know, getting capital and loans for vendors is really hard. A lot of those talked about the underdeveloped workforce and the kind of folks they could potentially hire. And then the organizational structure limitations is something that kind of varies. So anchors are privately owned and then publicly run. So that itself is a huge kind of issue where some anchor institutions can decide who they purchase from. Others, it's legislated, you know, and the way they do business is legislated. There's benefits to both and barriers to both. So it's not like being a privately owned anchor institution is going to make this all easier for you, and vice versa. So a lot of people talk about those kinds of things that pop up around hiring and purchasing. Some procurement in an agency is centralized, and some is decentralized. And so just like kind of control and communication over that is very different. One thing I learned is there's no way to really standardize anchor policies across anchors. You know, each anchor has to do it themselves. It's great to have a shared kind of agenda, but anchors, you cannot really expect one anchor to have the same outcome as another anchor for multiple reasons. Okay, so then phase two is when we went to the community and started doing work there. And so what we did is we started with the anchors and asked them who should we talk to. And then we went and asked those people who we should talk to. And we said, we want to talk to people who have had relationships with anchor institutions or stop with an anchor institution, or have even tried to work with an anchor institution and it didn't work. So we were really trying to some of the folks from the anchors, from the VIP, said at one point that we'll ask us why we're doing random interviews with people, which was really interesting. I learned so much about, just from their questions, what they meant is like, why would you talk to someone who isn't working with an anchor institution right now? So there was a different definition kind of that we had of like whose perspective we were trying to get. Luckily, the foundation who's funding our work thought like us, so we got to do this work. Two things about the interviews, and this, you know, we summarize when we talk about these. This is actually my favorite part to talk about because I learned so much from doing the interviews. But from the moment we stepped into the community, from the very first interview, the issue of structural racism came up always as like the tone of the whole interview. When you talk about anchors to a community person, the first thing they talk about is the structural issues, the social and political issues that are present. So if they're a nonprofit organization helping, if they are a resident, they talk about this and they don't hesitate. Where the anchor institutions, it's almost like not mentioned. You know, you just kind of don't mention these kinds of things. Here's some of the quotes that we got from this were really great. With our vendors, we said to them at the end of the interview, if you have 10 minutes with an anchor, like I have in front of, standing in front of an anchor institution, what would you tell them? And we recorded all of those. So we have, they all would talk for about 2 minutes, and they almost always talked about, this is what's wrong, and here's how you got to solve it. That's always, the phrasing of those. So we have these really awesome audio recordings that we're wishing we could use in some way of really meaningful thoughts by the community. The other thing was this culture of helping, and I want to write a whole book on this now, because once I learned from the residents in Baltimore about this kind of way of talking about problems, I did realize, I start to listen to it and hear it in a lot of communities. But a lot of folks immediately talked about how they help each other. So like a resident would say, I have a job at Johns Hopkins now, and he said, and so today I brought my neighbor and my nephew to this workforce development meeting. And, you know, they immediately talked about how if they got something, they were thinking about how to help their neighbors get it. And the workforce development agencies talk about that. The culture of helping in Baltimore is really strong. I mean, it's nothing you see on the media, right? Like one of the meetings we were at, called Turnaround Tuesday, we're in the basement of this church, and folks come on Tuesday mornings to, like, the first thing they do is introduce themselves, and then they ask them, here's a scenario, you put in an application in somewhere and you hadn't heard anything back, what are you going to do? And they went around the room, you know, to try to help people think about how to build their, you know, thinking around getting a job, and they do breakouts. And as we were there, the guy running it, like, paused and went over to the side and was on his phone, and I'm like, this guy's amazing, why is he on his phone, you know? And what he was doing was he had relationships with anchor institutions, and he would bring those anchor institutions into this church basement and have them interview people right there. And that particular morning, 6 of the people had gotten a second interview. So it was really neat to be able to see him call them out, and those people are like, you know, so the interesting thing is they were all, you know, this is the way they work together in the community. So the reason I bring it up, though, is that the culture of helping in the anchor institutions is a little bit void. They don't really talk about this as a helping thing. They talk about it as a solution to problem. How do we change the policy? It's not surprising. They're institutions, right? Institutions are bound by institutional design. The community are like nonprofits, right? And people, and they're creative and innovative, and they are full of really interesting ideas for how to fix these problems, and they are doing them. So the tone is kind of, it wasn't unexpected as much as it totally took us by surprise, you know, at the same time. So I really love this part of our work, and but let me go back to the topic. So I'll just go through this. We just grouped 2 things: procurement and capital investment we put together, and then hiring. So basically what people would say, you can see how many people we talked to in those categories. These are strengths that they would talk about in terms of how it helps them work with an anchor institution. So things like having personal relationships, knowledge of upcoming projects. So folks would say, I read in the paper that Johns Hopkins was doing a construction project, but I could not figure out who to call to find out how to get a contract or bid on it. The creativity in contracting, assessing the value of the organization. They feel like they can, some of the local companies said, we can actually provide better value than Staples, you know, or wherever. So, you know, if anchors could recognize how valuable our products are, they might choose us. And then a lot of folks talk about the support from purchasing agencies. So anchor institutions providing mentoring opportunities, anchor institutions saying, here's how you can work with us. Folks that, you know, I run a small windows company, I don't have time to walk the hall and figure out who their purchasing person is. So like they just don't have that time, so they talk about like kind of getting capacity building and anchors, you know, doing the work in their own, or I'm sorry, the vendors say they do it in their own businesses. Challenges, they just thought entry to the anchors was very difficult. The certification process I kind of mentioned. They talked about the systems, the anchors having no system of shared resources. Like they just didn't, every anchor had its own portal for how to like find anything. Lack of opportunities, the capacity to execute the job. Lengthy payment schedules don't work for small businesses. Having few capital investment resources, and they talked a lot about inauthentic partnerships, like for example, even in their own community. So if an anchor says, we're going to increase the number of minority and women-owned contracts, a lot of the white-owned, let's say, businesses will do something they call fronting, which is bring someone, minority or women, up to the ownership position so they are qualified. Or they just include them in the proposal, they get the proposal, and they never actually use the subcontractor. And anchors don't really follow through on that. You know, it's very hard to do that. So that was really interesting because in that question that I got asked a lot, what's your equity lens? This is a real equity lens kind of issue because you can say we're doing economic inclusion, you can say we have more contracts, but you might be causing more new racial tensions and issues in the community. So you kind of have to think through the system of that policy, like what happens when you implement that system inside, you know, the folks that are affected by it. Sorry, I'm trying to end here. This is actually the son of one of the vendors that we talked to. We always go back to this restaurant called Breaking Bread in Baltimore. I do this because if you go to Baltimore, it's like the best little spot in Baltimore. So you gotta go there. And this is Kimberly's son. So sweet. And in terms of workforce development, people talked about some of the strengths were when agencies, took a whole person approach to thinking about hiring, building partnerships. Let's see if there's stuff I haven't really said. I think I said just about everything here. I kind of want to show you something neat, not to limit the community voice section of the presentation, but I've mentioned a lot of it. This one, the job seeking, is what I want to talk about. So these folks just don't know. And even here, my friends the other day said, I want to leave my organization. How can I get a job? And I was like, go to every single university's job portal and look up the jobs in their portal, because there's no place to do it. In Colorado, we have, I think it's called Rocky Mountain Biz or something, a place where people can put bids into, a common place, but they don't have that in Baltimore. But this was interesting. So I just had a student, and I said, okay, pretend you're a person in Baltimore. We gave her a profile, and we said, and act like you're looking for a job, and go to all of our 9 anchor institutions and try to look for a job and code them by these categories. How easy, features that make the application process easy and features that make it hard. And we were able to see things like that there's no link on the homepage, or that they had to register to even look at jobs. And so you can see the categories. One reason I bring this up is that when I show this to the anchor institutions, they just love this. I mean, they're like, oh my gosh, you did that. And I'm thinking I could start like a whole consulting firm on doing this. And then on the flip side, I'm like, this is so great. In the whole presentation, they want this slide. And I'm like, go just do it. Like, go to your own portal and try to apply for a job. And you'll see that some organizations, this is about, the application being straightforward. This is like listing of sanitation engineer type things, using terms that don't seem like the right ones, and so forth. So you can kind of see which organizations, and it's clear that some organizations are just easier than others. Okay, so last 2 things here. When we presented back to everyone, this is what our slide said. These are the community-driven recommendations. They always ask us, how many of these are from you and how many of these are from the community? And we're like, no, really, they're all from the community. We didn't really put up things that we thought didn't reflect what the community told us. So, I've mentioned a lot of the things that folks talked about. This part, extending commitment to management, was one that anchors also kind of picked up on, was literally just sharing that leadership kind of thinking around economic inclusion with management, like having meetings with their hiring managers to talk about what's happening and even the planning phase. So really getting that organizational culture to kind of shift through. In terms of the network of anchors, I didn't really talk a lot about this, but across the board, people just did not believe the anchor institutions even had an authentic desire to have community at the table. They said sometimes yeah, the BIF asked me to come present, and I did, and they presented, and then they left, and then the board just went on, and they were like, we want to have a vote, we want to have a voice, we want to be sitting at the table with them. Those organizations that I will never do it again. So one time I presented to the anchors, and they were like, we need to get more community folks. Danielle, can you tell us who these people are so we can invite them to come talk to us? And I was like, don't do that. Because they don't want to have a quick invitation to present to you. They actually want to be sitting with you. And so they've broken a lot of trust by having these quick presentations for folks to come in. Or they'll say, yeah, the folks from the BIP came and they walked the halls at our organization, and that was it, But there's just a big, and even the representation on the BIP is not diverse. They have 2 African-American folks who sit on the whole thing, one on the governance board, and that's kind of crazy. Last thing. So I just kind of wanted to show a picture of our briefs and how we try to communicate back. And what we're doing is we have the 3 briefs in the final report, and we're working on journal articles. This last piece is we've had in the works for about 6 months to do this community presentation where we invite all 110 people back and do a presentation for them. And the foundation is on board. And then it started to get difficult because the BIP isn't really that supportive of this, because they're a little worried about bringing community folks together with anchors and how to manage that relationship in a large group kind of makes them nervous. We have done a lot of work to make sure, like, we won't present. We have a local facilitator. We have a woman who's worked for the mayor, and then Annie Casey now for a firm, and she's on our team for this. Like, we realize, like, we can't be the face of this. So we have a lot of, and we have a national speaker who speaks on equity. Like, we really tried to make it attractive to a lot of folks. We're doing it in the community. We had a date, and then the BIP actually said, no, we can't do it because they hadn't sorted out enough of what happens when we bring people together to talk about hard topics and they have an issue and we don't know how to address it. It's fair. We're actually meeting tomorrow and for their retreat, and they'll talk about it again. We're not sure if we'll get to do it, actually. Our goal was to just say, hey, you spent an hour of an interview time with us, so here's what turned out. The problem really is that no one wants to say they are doing it. We can't do it, obviously. University of Colorado can't come give this presentation. The foundation doesn't want to be the one doing it. We thought the BIP would sponsor it, and that's a no. The BIP does, the anchors have to say they're doing it. But that's the reason. So our goal, if this fails, is we're going to contact our community folks that we interviewed, give them the material, like we promised, and say, if any of you want to host a community presentation, let us know. If one of them will host it, kind of own it, we can do it. But the politics behind it, we couldn't start there. Couldn't ask the community to be the first phase. So there's just a lot there that we, are trying to kind of sort through. So our hope is that we will get to do that presentation, and don't know yet. So I know I've just talked for longer than I thought. I only had 21 slides. Too long. So does anyone have any questions or yeah?
I think this is amazing work. I'm honestly amazed that there was so much buy-in from all the anchors. Mm-hmm. And I was curious, were there any incentives to them to even think about these different approaches to hiring and, from the mayor, from the city?
Oh, yeah. And are you meaning financial incentives?
Any incentives. I mean, obviously financial, but, just to get them to think that way, I feel like it's, they're usually about the bottom line.
Yeah. So this is probably the best question. Like, it's the crux of everything, right? Because what does come up a lot is that people very frankly talk about you have to make the business case for economic inclusion when you're talking about these institutions. And in my own organization in Colorado, Day is here, she's running with Mile High Connect, like the anchor kind of learning cohort. And then Amy from Kaiser is another anchor in town, trying to think about this. And this is a conversation that, and I have been in, this makes me feel really important, in a meeting with the chancellor, where we've been talking about this. And the bottom line is important and it comes up. So, it's a funny line though, because it's almost like saying we want to be mission driven, but we have to more like kind of how nonprofits function, but there's the bottom line. So it's the tension, right? And I don't think there's a good solution, and to be honest, there is no common solution. Every banker has to sort that out themselves. So like a solution. So it's interesting the way you asked it though. So having the incentive is interesting because I think that's something I actually hadn't, we could have probed on more in why that culture shift happened. Like when we came on the scene, all 9 anchor institutions were talking about this. Right. The precursor to that was huge, and I do think the BIP had a lot to do with it. I mean, getting 9 anchors around the table and kind of making everyone have to say whether they're in or out, is kind of a big deal. So by the time we got there, they were all in. So why they did that is I don't know as much about. But then what is so different is, and what they haven't really done well is measure their outcomes. I think if you started to measure the outcomes, I think you'd see very little shift in the needle. Because of what you just said, because incentives are difficult. This anchor work is a little bit more like when people started talking about network, that's a hot topic and exciting, and now the universities and also talking about anchor work. So it's a little bit shinier, I think, right now than real. So it's going to take a lot of time, and there's a lot of people right now trying to ask questions about implementing it, best practices. So I don't know, and the return on investment for hiring local extends past the organization. So if they say there's an incentive because our neighbors become, are more educated and they become healthier, and by that outcome, they become better customers in our organization. Like, if they go that far, there would be, but most people are not big system thinkers like that. I can't wait, right? Or depends on who's in the administration, changes a lot too, so, yeah.
Kind of a similar question has to do with sort of sustainability, and I kept wondering what the input was on the front end to get this going, and if that input were to go away, I assume that the foundation had some input into it, and, is there a sense of sustainability? And then also, as an evaluator, it seems like there's a lot yet still to happen potentially with this project, and, what are the goals for different places along the trajectory to measure?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
So in terms of sustainability, do you mean the actual network?
I just mean the whatever
The big picture.
Yeah, the big picture and the goals of the, endeavor.
Yeah. At individual anchor institutions, that varies. Like Johns Hopkins University has a person that they hired, and his title is something like economic inclusion manager. So at the institutions, that commitment varies. That's real rare. Johns Hopkins University is known for really modeling this well, and the hospital. But and then, for example, like at Coppin State and Morgan State University, there's no practices they're changing. This is just their way. They really fall into it. So sustainability is almost varies based on this a little bit in terms of how they've committed to it now. As that network a bit, it's a difficult time actually that the foundation, the NAKC Foundation is not funding it anymore. I think they are struggling for funding. At the same time, the old mayor and the new mayor, they both had anchors as a priority, an anchor initiative. It's kind of like dueling anchor initiatives in Baltimore. It's still kind of the conversations happening. So if they can kind of figure that out, and I think if it became more institutionalized in the local government kind of infrastructure, I think there's more opportunity for sustainability of the actual organization, and they're open to that. So they are literally strategic retreating tomorrow to kind of figure out what they need to do. And and in terms of measurement, so we're done except for this meeting. I think there's a ton we could do to follow this, which isn't in the plan right now. Inside, they're doing a lot of work to think about measurement. The problem is they don't have an infrastructure for measurement. There's not even like a methodology yet, design what are the measures, and then who inside the organization is supposed to measure. Because we're talking about all parts of these huge institutions. So the methodology for that needs to be institution specific. At a university, they might talk, and they do talk about, can students help with measuring? I mean, they're literally like, who's going to do the measuring? And it's got to be somehow inside the institution, because it can't be a one-shot thing. It has to be systemic. But it's interesting, the Democracy Collaborative is an institution that's kind of trying to help people think this through. One of the things they're trying to promote is shared measures, because they're following this collective impact model. And I told them, I think that's a mistake. I'm like, there's no way in Colorado, University of Colorado, Denver, and Kaiser, I don't expect us to have shared measures. We might have shared goals, and we might be able to say we both are trying to think about measuring things in the same area. We're starting from different places. Our priorities are different. So I think there's a gap here. There's a real role for and I think evaluation is a really great way to frame it. Like, how do you create measures that can evaluate their processes from feasibility, return on investment, to actual accomplishments, and maybe even systemic impact? It's a design that, maybe I should think about that, but I think you're onto something. I think we're a little bit too new to see folks doing that systematically. One-offs are probably more common right now.
I've gone over, but I have a really, really quick question. So you mentioned in your methods that you did your Excel and your NVivo.
Yeah. What was the
Sort of result of that little experiment?
So, and both of them, really what any kind of tool to analyze qualitative data does is just, it's just a tool, right? So it's all the thinking behind it that's important. But I think that we all, the Excel work is a lot easier to share. Like literally I can email you my Excel file and you can work on it. And that right there kind of, I think, decided it for us. So we wouldn't have to figure out how to, kind of make sure you're on a computer with NVivo and that kind of stuff. The only thing that NVivo had a real advantage to was literally you could click on the document and go back to it. And we don't do that here. We weren't embedding the document. We'd actually have to go to another file, find the document, and in NVivo, like you can highlight that quote, link it, and there it is. For us, that's not enough of an advantage because of our kind of practice of data reduction. We try never to go back to the document. That's kind of a practice we're trying to get past that, because if we think we're going to go back to documents, we'll be doing this forever to start the practice. So it's rare that we go back to documents that way after we start moving forward. So for us, that was good. But that piece right there was a big difference, that you couldn't go back and do that link. But the counts, in NVivo or Atlas or whatever, it's the problem, of course, is that if I code data saying, one thing 3 times, it'll count it 3 times. And I don't know if I haven't used it enough to know if you can change that now, but so actual counts of mentions of a code are almost inaccurate in these programs, and that's the experience I've had using both Atlas and NVivo, is that, they'll say we do matrix, of stuff, but it's all kind of like messed up because something was mentioned by the same person 5 times and it counts as 5. So that was a big advantage of using the other one, is that if you want to do that work, which a lot of people don't want to quantify qualitative data, I know that really is like, then that was a better approach for doing that. So, yeah. I wish you were a little paper on that. I don't know. All right. So,
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And if everyone will sign in as you leave, we'd love to know that you were here. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it.
I wasn't like,